Well, welcome again. This is session 10 as we work our way through the Gospel of Matthew. In session 10, we'll be looking at chapter 8 of Matthew's Gospel. So, if you would like to follow along on screen, that's great. I always recommend that you have your Bible open. That way, you can make marks, highlight things, make little notes in the margins. Your version may be different than mine. Mine is the NIV, the New International Version, the 1984 edition. So a little different than the modern NIV, but not so different that it causes any issues. So with that, let's get into chapter 8. The man with leprosy. Chapter 8, verse 1. When he came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Immediately he was cured of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. Now I'm taking this apart a little bit because there's a lot of information here. By the way, I'll get to it when we get to verse 3. Let's start at verse 1. When he came down from the mountainside. So chapter 8 is following immediately on the heels of the Sermon on the Mount. And we remember back in chapter 5, we were told that Jesus went up the side of a mountain, sat down, called his disciples to him, and large crowds came with him. And he taught them. So back in chapter 4, we're told that Jesus was mighty in word and in deed. So in chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, we get to hear how Jesus was mighty in his teaching. And we get to see the reaction of the crowd. You know, they're really impressed by him because he teaches with authority. And now in chapter 8, we're going to hear a series of healing miracles. And we're going to see how Jesus was mighty in deed as well. And there's a lot to say about that. So at any rate, verse 2. As Jesus is coming down the mountain, we're not told exactly where or when, but a man with leprosy came and knelt before him. Right? Now, leprosy was kind of a big deal back in the ancient world. Today, we call it Hansen's disease, but that's a very specific skin condition. Leprosy in the ancient world could cover a broad array of skin infections and diseases. So we're not exactly sure if this is a guy that had Hansen's disease or not. But leprosy was very contagious, and in ancient Israel, when they were wandering in the wilderness for 40 years, if a person came down with leprosy, then the law demanded that they were to remove themselves from the camp. They weren't allowed to be around the rest of the nation of Israel because of fear of infection. So they would start little camps, or if there were enough lepers, little colonies, and they weren't allowed to come around any people. And in Jesus' day, that was still kind of true. You know, there wasn't a central camp, but you had to go outside into the lonely places. You could hang out with other lepers, but you couldn't hang out with people that were so-called healthy. In fact, the law required that if you had leprosy and someone was approaching you, you had to call out, leper, leper, unclean, unclean, right, to warn people not to come near. So what we see here in verse 2 is something kind of extraordinary, right? This man has a lot of courage to break social protocol and to approach Jesus. Now, Jesus is out in the wilderness, in the lonely places, in the mountainside, so he is kind of on the guy's terrain. But still, that the man would approach Jesus. We don't know how close he got, but that he approached him and doesn't shout out, unclean, unclean, leper, leper. He says instead, Jesus, or Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And then Jesus' reaction. He reaches out his hand and touches the man and says, I am willing. I've always loved this episode. Here's a man in obvious need, and he asks Jesus. He asks him humbly. He asks him out of faith in him. He looks to Jesus, believes that Jesus can heal him. He doesn't demand that Jesus heal him. He isn't even what we would call forthright, right? He adds that phrase, if you are willing. So there's the humbleness of the man. And Jesus doesn't beat around the bush. He doesn't take time to think about it. As soon as the man is done speaking, Jesus reaches out his hand and touches him and says, I am willing, be clean. And immediately the man is cured of leprosy. I mean, if that doesn't speak to how Jesus cares for people and the concern that he has for people and the sympathy and compassion that he has for people, then I don't know what does. It's just great. Lord, if you are willing, make me clean. And Jesus says, I am willing. And so Jesus does something that no one in his day and age would have done. He touches a leper. And Jesus doesn't become diseased. Rather, the disease is driven out of the man. Jesus isn't made ceremonially unclean. Rather, he cleanses the man that he touches. So here we see that Jesus has complete power and authority over even the worst of diseases, or what some people thought were the worst of diseases. But then we get to verse 4, and this kind of confuses a lot of people. Jesus says, see that you don't tell anyone. Right? Why would Jesus tell him not to tell anyone? Right? You would think that if Jesus had come into the world to be the Messiah, to be the Savior of people, that he would want the word to get out. Right? But that's not the case here. He tells the man not to tell anyone. Now, there are a few places in Matthew's Gospel where this happens, where Jesus performs a miracle or has an encounter with someone, and then when they're about to part, he says, shh, keep it to yourself. Don't tell anyone. Right? It's called the Messianic secret. Right? Jesus is the Messiah, and eventually the world will know that he is. But at the moment, he doesn't want a widespread broadcast of the fact that he is. Why? Well, because he hasn't accomplished everything that he's come to accomplish. And furthermore, he's starting to get large crowds that are following him. We don't know what the crowds think about Jesus. We know that there's some confusion or some sitting on the fence in terms of what the crowds think about Jesus. One thing becomes clear, though, as we continue to work through this chapter and the rest of the gospel, that Jesus kind of gets a reputation for being a miracle worker. So Jesus doesn't want to be surrounded by crowds that are going to demand miracles from him and acclaim him as Messiah, their understanding of Messiah, and try to make him a king. Because in the mind of Israel at that time, the Messiah was going to be a political king or a political leader who would most likely throw off Roman oppression and establish Israel as an independent nation and perhaps even the greatest of nations. So Jesus hasn't come to be that kind of a Messiah, and so he doesn't want word going out because he doesn't want to be made that kind of a king right now. So we continue on. Verse 5, when Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and said to those following him, I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, Go, it will be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that very hour. So here we have a healing miracle, right? Differs quite a bit from the one that we just read. In this case, Jesus is going to perform the miracle at a distance, right? He offers to go to the home of the centurion to heal his servant, but the centurion says, no, no, no. Right? I know how authority works, right? You stand in a chain of command as a soldier in the Roman army. You've got people above you, and you're obligated to do what they order you to do, and you've got people below you that are obligated to do what you say. And Jesus, I recognize that you have supreme authority. So all you have to do is speak it, and it will be done. And so this man is filled with faith, and he recognizes the authority that Jesus has. And here's the kicker. He's a centurion, right? He's not a Jew. He is a Roman soldier. Now, we don't know what his nationality was. Probably wasn't from Italy, but he may have been. It really doesn't matter. The point of it is that he is not a member of the children of Israel, right? And yet he believes in Jesus and believes in his authority. And that's something that as Jesus has been going around preaching and teaching, he hasn't found too much of that kind of faith in Israel. And so Jesus is kind of astonished at it, right? And he has some high words of praise for this centurion. And it becomes an opportunity for Jesus to proclaim that he has come to institute, to bring in the kingdom of heaven, God's rule and reign, and that kingdom will incorporate people from all nations, not just Israel. Yes, he came to Israel. He preaches and does his activity in Israel because he is Israel's Messiah. That is, God's chosen people that he had given the promise of the Messiah to. But the work that Jesus does will incorporate all of humanity. So at the end of time, right, people that are in the kingdom of God at the end of time will include not only Jews, but Gentiles as well. And that will be surprising, right? That's something that was unexpected and unanticipated amongst Jewish people and Jewish believers and Jewish theologians. So, Jesus tells the man to go, and his servant will be healed. And at that very hour, that very moment, right, the servant was healed. So again, showing the authority that Jesus has over sickness and illness. So we'll continue on. Maybe. There we go. All right, beginning at verse 14, reading through verse 22. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. Well, let's stop there and just look at verses 14 through 17 here for a moment. On a surface level reading, there are some things to point out. They're in Capernaum. Jesus comes to Peter's house, right? So Peter was from Capernaum. Peter has a mother-in-law, so obviously Peter is married. And Paul makes an allusion in one of his letters that Peter and the other disciples, when they were doing their missionary journeys, would bring their wives with them. So Peter's wife is still alive. His mother-in-law is obviously living with them, but she's sick, right? Lying in bed with a fever. So Jesus comes into Peter's house and he sees the woman lying there, suffering with sickness, with a high fever. And he approaches her, he comes to her and touches her hand, and the fever immediately leaves her. And her response is that she gets up and begins to serve him. Right? So you could preach a whole sermon on this, but I'll resist that temptation and just make a sweeping comment here. That here we see Jesus again showing his compassion and his empathy towards those who are caught in the web of evil and sin that constitutes this world, right? So he doesn't even wait to be asked, right? He just approaches her, touches her, and the fever leaves her. Then in verse 16, we hear that Jesus heals those who are demon-possessed. Now, this usually raises a question for people, and it's a good question for us to ask. Is there such thing as demon possession? And if so, what does it look like? So, there are books that are written about this. There are articles that are written about this. You read a variety of different opinions, I suppose. But here's what the teaching of the Bible is, right? The Bible clearly says that there are such things as demons, right? These are malicious forces of evil, right? Who are demons? Well, one answer to that, and probably the correct answer, is this. We know that when Satan rebelled against God, he took a third of the angels with him, right? That comes from the book of Revelation. So a third of the angels, they were good angels originally, rebelled against God, and they were cast out of heaven with the devil, with Satan. Right? And Satan is called the Lord or the master of the demons. Right? And so demons are fallen angels. That's what they are. Now, the thing to know about angels is that angels are very powerful beings, right? They're spiritual beings. They don't have physical bodies, though they can appear to have physical bodies, but the bodies aren't real. Right? They don't have physical bodies. They're very powerful. We're told in the Old Testament that at least on one occasion, an angel killed an army of 10,000 people. We're told that the angel of death killed all of the firstborn in Egypt on the night of Passover. Right? And so we shouldn't downplay the role of the forces of evil, of demons in our world today. Now, what would demon possession look like today? Well, I suppose it can take many forms, but here in America, I think that most demon possession is going to appear to us to be mental illness. Right? I worked in a mental health hospital when I was first out of college. My degree was in psychology. So I was working at a inpatient unit, and I was just fortunate enough to be working with some people that were Christians. There was a group of 4 or 5 of us that were pretty strong Christians. Each of us came from different denominational backgrounds. But we found a bond there, and periodically we would talk about what we were seeing in the hospital and how that related to information that we get in the Bible. And I remember one social worker who had tons of experience, had been in the field for 23 years, I think it was at the time, saying this. She said, most of the people that come through here are just mentally ill, right? But occasionally I've seen patients that I believe are not only mentally ill but also demon-possessed, and they tend to be the ones that are extraordinarily religiously focused, focused on Christianity especially, right? Those, I think, are folks that are demon-possessed. And not that I had tons of experience, but I kind of hung on to that, and I believe that today, right? I think that mental illness is a real thing, obviously. I also think that demon possession is a real thing, and I think that to most people in our society, demon possession would look like mental illness. But demon possession is different than mental illness. Demon possession may cause mental illness, but it is not synonymous with mental illness either. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's mentally ill is demon possessed. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think that the percentage of people that are mentally ill and have a possession by a demon is extraordinarily small. But then I have no way of knowing what the numbers are, and neither does anyone else. So there's my little spiel on demons and demon possession. So back to the text. Many who were demon possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word, and then also engages in more ministry of healing. And then we're told that Jesus' ministry of healing and driving out demons was a fulfillment of a prophecy given by Isaiah hundreds of years before. Comes from chapter 51 of Isaiah's book. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, when Jesus touches someone who's sick, the sickness comes into Jesus. But rather, Jesus associates himself with those who are obviously suffering from the effects of sin and evil in this world. In fact, we're told in the Bible in many places that the evil that we see in the world is really the result of human sin, but it also has demonic power behind it. And so here's the thing I want to say before we go any further about Jesus' ministry of healing, his miracles in which he heals. We've read 3 of them so far. We're going to encounter others as we go through the gospel. But here's the thing to know about his miracles of healing. When Jesus heals, he is giving a little foretaste of the great healing that will take place when he returns again in glory. Right? You remember what Jesus came to do? He came to undo the works of the devil. Right? In a theological sense, he came to undo the sin that Adam and Eve had fallen into. Right? When they disobeyed God, they fell into sin and fell under the domain and the influences of Satan and demons and other forces of evil. Right? And they were made susceptible to death, to illness, to sickness, to all kinds of mischief and evilness. And Jesus has come to undo all of that. He's going to do that through his death and his resurrection. And he's promised that when he returns again in glory, he will renew or remake the heavens and the earth so that they are pristine once again. There will be no hint of sin or any of sin's corroding effects. And that's one way that I like to talk about sin, is sort of an acid that corrodes, right? So Jesus has come to undo that. So in these situations where Jesus is confronting people who are sick or ill, they are people that are caught in the clutches of evil and the effects, the marring, corrosive effects of sin. And Jesus releases them from that. Right? He releases them from the domain of the devil. And when he returns again in glory, it will be done for all of creation, for every single one of us. And unlike the people that Jesus heals, who eventually do die from old age or whatever, it will be an eternal healing that Jesus brings. So it's taking a little bit of what's going to happen at the end times and bringing it into the present and unleashing it in a microcosmic space, right? The space of an individual person's body. So that's what the miracles of Jesus are about. They show us he has complete authority over the forces of evil, the forces opposed to God, the forces that have trapped humanity in this veil of tears, as it said. So Jesus has complete authority over everything, over sickness, over health, over life, over death, over demons and the demonic, over Satan himself. And he's come to set people free. All right. Now on to verse 18. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Now, this is an interesting passage, right? Some people get confused by it. They think that Jesus is being less than merciful. But let's see what Jesus is really teaching here. All right. A teacher approaches Jesus, teacher of the law, right? A scribe or a Pharisee. "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go." And Jesus says, "Well, before you make that commitment, you better take some thought as to what you're promising here. I'm an itinerant preacher. I travel around. I don't have a permanent home. I have no place to lay my head. So understand what you're getting yourself into." So Jesus is sort of teaching here that we need to count the cost of discipleship. Right? Another disciple comes and says, "Lord, let me first go and bury my father." Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Now, there are a couple ways that you can understand verse 21. It could be that the man's father has just died, and he's making a reasonable request. He wants to bury his father before he takes off running with Jesus. But there's another way to understand this passage, okay? And it's this, that the obligation to take care of parents was a big thing in the ancient world, much more so than it seems to be in America in the 20th and 21st centuries. And so when a person was getting older, son or daughter might bring their parent to live with them. In this case, it's a son and a father. And the father would live with that person until he died, and the son would take care of him and then give him a appropriate burial. If that's what this passage is referring to, then we're not talking about someone whose father just died and the son wants to take a day or two to bury his father. We're talking about a son who wants to follow Jesus but feels that his primary obligation is to his father. And he wants to hang around with his dad until his dad passes away and he can take care of him like a good son should. And that helps us understand what Jesus' words mean. Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead. Right? The dead being people who are spiritually dead, right? Who don't have faith in Jesus, who are still in their sins. Right? Let such people take care of people who have physically died. So what is Jesus teaching in verses 18 through 22? Well, he's teaching that we have to count the cost of discipleship. But he's also saying this, that our top priority needs to be Jesus. Right? He needs to come before all of our priorities in life. Our priorities for wealth, for fame, for fortune, for position, for power, for authority, our priorities of having other relationships before him. Later on, Jesus will say that he has come to divide families, right? To pit sons against their fathers, daughters against their mothers, and so on and so forth. And what he means there is the same thing here, right? That our top priority needs to be our relationship with Jesus, and let everything else take second seat to Jesus. because only Jesus can bring us everlasting life. Only He can bring us salvation. And so when conflicts arise, we need to keep our priority on Jesus. All right, let's move on. Jesus calms the storm. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." All right, so kind of a neat story here. Again, a miracle story. This time not a miracle of healing, but a miracle that involves the forces of nature. So we see what's going on, right? Jesus and his disciples are going across the lake, and Jesus is sound asleep when a big storm comes up. And what's interesting to me is that most of the disciples of Jesus were professional fishermen, right? And they're used to storms. They don't scare easily. But this particular storm scared them, right? They're afraid for their lives. They even wake up Jesus screaming out, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." You know? And Jesus' reply is interesting. You know, he doesn't hop up and say, "Okay, what can I do?" You know, I kind of picture him as kind of yawning, stretching. "Ah, you of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Right? If they had faith in him, if they knew who he really was, then they wouldn't have worried, right? He is the Son of God, right? The natural powers of nature are not going to harm him or anyone that is in that boat with him. So they really had no reason to be afraid. Right? I mean, let's say the worst had happened. Let's say that the boat did capsize and they drowned. Right? Jesus can still overcome death, and he can resurrect people. So really, there's no reason for any of them to be afraid. So what does he do? He gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves, and immediately there was calmness there. Now, there's something about this storm that some commentators in the on the Bible through the centuries have noted, right? That this particular storm, because it was threatening Jesus and his disciples, may have had demonic forces behind it, right? That this was an attack on Jesus and his disciples from demonic forces working through the natural order. And if that's the case, then it really gives us a picture, again, of how Jesus has come into this world to overcome the forces of evil, right? He isn't afraid that the powers of evil working through the power of nature are going to be able to harm him. He gets up and he rebukes them, and immediately there's calmness, right? Immediately, he takes command over the forces of evil, the forces that threaten them at the very least, whether or not there are demonic forces behind it or not. Right? And the result for the disciples is that they're amazed, but we also see their lack of understanding of who Jesus is. Right? What kind of a man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. So what can we say about the faith of the disciples? We know that they are disciples, that they have faith, but we also see from instances like this that their understanding, their comprehension of who Jesus is very, very small right now. We might say that they have like a seedling of faith, but it hasn't grown into maturity yet. And it won't until after the resurrection, in fact, until Pentecost. So as we make our way through the gospel, we're going to look at the reactions of the crowds to Jesus, but we're also going to look at the reactions of the disciples to Jesus, right? Because we are disciples of Jesus. And maybe we'll learn some things about the nature of faith by watching how the disciples react to Jesus. So here we see that they don't have very much understanding of who Jesus is. Their faith is small and weak, but that doesn't cause Jesus to cast them out or to disassociate himself from them. He rebukes them for their little faith and encourages them to believe what their eyes are seeing and to take that to its natural conclusion. Only God has power over the forces of nature. And if Jesus has power over the forces of nature, then he must be more than just a man. He must be fully God himself. But the disciples are a little slow on the uptake. Right? So we'll have a lot more to say about that as we continue through the gospel. So, are we going on? Having some technical difficulty here. There we go. And the final section of chapter 8 here, the healing of 2 demon-possessed men. When he, that is Jesus, arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass that way. "What do you want with us, Son of God?" they shouted. "Have you come here to torture us before the appointed time?" Some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, "If you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs." He said to them, "Go." So they came out and went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and died in the water. Those tending the pigs ran off, went into the town, and reported all of this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. Then the whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave their region. All right, so here again we have a miracle of Jesus driving out demons, showing once again his power over the demonic. Right? He is fully God. And on the last day, as powerful as demons are, they have no power over Jesus. Right? They still have a commander. They don't want to recognize his authority, but they still have a commander, and they are still obligated to obey him. And so Jesus here drives out these demons from these 2 men. So what do we know about these 2 men? They're demon-possessed. They were living in an area where there were tombs. Now, in ancient Israel, I'm not sure about the practices today, but in ancient Israel, tombs were, by and large, in caves, right? So if there was a cave or a hill, you would carve out, if there wasn't a natural cave there, you would carve out a chamber, and your bodies were buried there. And so apparently, this is somewhere near where there were a multitude of tombs in the face of a hill or a mountain. Why do they live there? Well, probably because no one wants to be around them. They're so violent, we're told, that no one could pass that way. And they're hanging out in an area of death, right? Which I suppose goes to show that they're demon-possessed, right? Demons want to take us away from life, take us away from God, keep us bound in things that are vile and creepy, right? And so these two men are forced by the demons to be living in the area where there are a lot of tombs. They're violent, as mentioned, right? When the men see Jesus, the demons in them cry out, "What do you want with us, Son of God?" So here's something to notice, right? We talk about noticing what the crowds are doing in regards to Jesus, what the disciples are doing in regards to Jesus. They don't know who Jesus is, but the demons do. They see Jesus, they immediately recognize him as the Son of God, and they call him just that, right? So the forces of the demonic knew who Jesus was, but they didn't believe in him. It wouldn't have done any good even if they had, because Jesus didn't come to save spiritual beings. He came to save humanity, right? But they don't believe in him. So there is a difference between head knowledge and faith, right? There are people today who know who Jesus is and know a lot about him, right? They may read the Bible, not for faith, but because they want to find holes in it so that when they're talking with Christians, they can show them how foolish they are. Or, any number of reasons. People can know who Jesus is, but not believe in him. Right? So head knowledge is not the same as faith, and it's good for us to remember that. Now we're told that there is a large herd of pigs feeding nearby. So this helps us locate, in some regards, where this took place. Pigs were unclean animals. Jews weren't supposed to eat them. So this wouldn't have been somewhere where there were a lot of Jewish people living. Right? This is a Gentile region if there are herds of pigs around. And for whatever reason, the demons ask that they be allowed to go into the pigs. I'm not sure why, but Jesus obliges and says, go ahead. And the demons show that no matter who or what they're possessing, their intent is always destruction. The entire herd of pigs runs down the bank into a lake and dies in the water. Now the effect on those who are tending the flock is they wig out, right? They run back to the town, they tell everyone about this, including what happened to the demon-possessed men, and one assumes the pigs, so that the whole town comes out to meet Jesus, and when they see him, they plead with him to leave their region. They're afraid of him, right? They don't want to have someone that has the power to do that around them. It's too much. It's like grabbing hold of an electric cord. You don't want to do that. So here, in this instance, the effect that Jesus' miracle of driving out demons has on crowds is that they are afraid of him, and their fear causes them to reject him. Reject him. Something that people today need to be aware of, right? That we don't want to let our fears, especially fears about Jesus or about God, cause us to drive him away, to reject faith or to give up faith. And someone might say, well, why would anyone today be afraid of Jesus? Well, there's a lot that can be said about that, and I'll return to that later in the gospel. So there it is, our first foray into looking at Jesus' miracles, covering chapter 8 of Matthew's gospel. Join us again next week for session 11. We'll be getting into chapter 9, so if you want to read that chapter ahead of time, write down things that you observe in the text and bring that with you, then you might get some more benefit out of our time together, even though we can't speak or interact. You can always email me with questions. My email address is all lowercase. It's egawura@gmail.com. That's egawura@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to share those questions. I'll keep you anonymous, but talk about those questions in our next session. Thank you. God bless.